Story time about how my grandma got married when she was 14 years old. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. So just picture it. I'm sitting with my 94-year-old grandma in the kitchen, and suddenly she starts talking about my grandpa. My grandpa passed away almost 10 years ago. And to be fair, they did have a wonderful marriage. By all accounts, and by all of my family's accounts, they were totally in love until the moment he took his last breath. Here's how the story goes. The first time they met, she was 12 years old. He had just gotten back from the war. She was walking home from school with her backpack, and my 27-year-old grandpa pulls up in his car. He starts to tell her that she's going to be his future wife and that he's going to talk to her parents so that they can get married. He kept inviting her into his car, but she kept saying no. He followed her home from school every single day. As my grandma is telling the story, everyone is laughing except for me. Finally, one day he followed her to her house, knocked on the door, and requested to speak to my great-grandfather. They spoke for an hour, and that's when my great-grandpa promised my grandma to my grandpa, and he gave them permission to get married when she was 14. At first, he wanted them to get to know each other, so they started going on dates. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. And if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. This is when my great-grandfather promised my 12-year-old grandma to my 27-year-old grandfather. My great-grandpa thought that it would be best they wait 2 years so that they can get married when she's 14. In the meantime, he suggested that they start going out on dates. Yes, a 12-year-old girl and a 27-year-old man. By the way, as my grandma is telling this story, all of my cousins are laughing at this. I'm trembling in my seat. She explained to us that for those 2 years, my grandfather was on his best behavior, and that essentially they read books together, they walked together by the lake, and he would take her out to see movies. She said at the time it was a big deal. Going to the movies was like a big treat. I guess it made me feel better knowing that he didn't try to do anything to her at the time. Still, it's absolutely disgusting. Finally, the 2 years passed, and at this point, they're totally in love. They get married. Both their families attended this wedding. How did no one in their families think it was inappropriate? Watching a 14-year-old get married to a 29-year-old man? But it gets worse. Part 3 is up. Story time about how my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14 years old and he was 29. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. This is the third and last part, and if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. 2 years pass and they get married. My grandma even told us that the night of their wedding, my great-grandparents gifted them a night at a hotel so that they could have some privacy. You can imagine what happened. My grandmother described it as the most liberating night of her life. 2 months later, she was pregnant. Their first baby was born right before she turned 15, and then she got pregnant again at 15, and then at 17, and then at 18, 19, and finally 20. My grandfather got into oil in his late 20s. He made about $1 million by the time he was 35, so he was able to give them a very comfortable life. He purchased a manor. They had 3 housekeepers, 1 butler, and 4 nannies, and they had a really happy life. My grandma says my grandpa was always affectionate with her, and she said they blessed their bed every single night. After she finishes telling the story, all of my cousins laugh and think it's cute. I was disturbed. I asked her why it was okay to get married at such a young age. And then I said, would you have wanted me to get married when I was 14? That's when she said that times were just different back then. The war was happening, and people didn't know if they would live or die. She also said that when a catch like my grandfather turned up, most parents were looking for a man like my grandfather to marry off their daughters. Grandpa was educated, handsome, driven, had great work ethic, and he took care of her, which is what he promised my great-grandpa. And then when the children came, he more than took care of them. He even took care of my great-grandparents too. He ended up moving them into the manor in their old age, and they were fully taken care of by the staff. Apparently, the manor was big enough to fit in 4 families. Now, I loved my grandfather. He was a great, kind man, and I myself benefited off the generational wealth. He paid for my education, and I'm now a lawyer for it. But still, a huge part of me feels absolutely disgusted with the history of their love. Even though back then that might have been normal, I think it's horrendous. Yes, they had a great love story, but she was a child. Apparently, this was a big family secret. None of the uncles or my parents wanted us to know. I got into a huge argument with my parents for hiding this from me. They think I'm totally overreacting. Am I, though? I guess I'll need more therapy. What do you think? My boyfriend confessed he got his ex-girlfriend pregnant. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. This girl was completely obsessed with me. She stalked me for over a month. One day my boyfriend shows up to my parents' house bawling. That's when my dad told him that he needed to leave. My parents were terrified this girl would do something to me. And that's when he just said to us, she's pregnant. A few days before we went out on our first date, they ended up hooking up one last time. Apparently she had been begging him. She swears up and down that the baby is his, but my parents don't buy it. My boyfriend now feels extremely guilty for bringing her into my life. Now my boyfriend has to take her to all the doctor's appointments. And she asked me to step aside. I didn't know what else to do, so I broke up with him. With a caveat, we're still seeing each other in secret, but this has stopped her from stalking me. Once the baby's born, there will be a paternity test. I guess I'll update you guys then. Bye. Story time about how I married a married man. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sending me on Instagram. Years ago, I met this guy that I thought was really cute. Stupid and naive, and I believed everything he said. I worked in customer service. He came into my job one day and just started flirting with me, and I was like thrilled. My job was really boring. This cute guy comes in and just starts talking to me, and I just fall in love. I'm not exaggerating. I know it's pathetic. I couldn't believe that he was talking to me and that he was interested in me. The next day, he asked me for my phone number, and I gave it to him. I went on one date, and I was legit in love. It starts to get creepy. He was 20 years older than me, and you could say he GROOMED'd me. See, I didn't know what was happening. I was 19, I had never had a boyfriend, and I barely had ever been kissed. Played me like a fiddle. After 2 weeks of going on dates, he finally kissed me. I knew that he was the man I wanted to marry. But when I told my coworker about him, she told me that he was married. I asked him about it. He told me that my coworker must have been mistaking him for his brother, because his brother and him had similar names and the brother was married. 2 days later, I asked one of his friends about it. That's when his friend tells me that he doesn't even have a brother and that he had been married for 15 years to a girl that was also 20 years younger than him. Even knowing this, I still married him. And you'll never guess how. Part 2 is already up. Story time about how I married a guy who was already married. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's on Instagram. Even though I knew he was already married to somebody else, and even though I knew he lied to me about already being married, I still went ahead and married him. I was completely obsessed with him. Because he was already legally married to somebody else, we decided to use a different name for him, and somehow it worked. We actually drove 5 hours away to get married, used fake names, filed in a different state, and then we drove back to our hometown, where literally no one knew we were married. It was our little secret. But then the poo hit the fan. He kept promising that he would leave his wife. But one day, I'm having dinner with my parents at a restaurant, and guess who shows up? My husband with his wife. And boy, did they look happy. He was all over her, kissing her neck and her hands. Not only until he realized that I was in the restaurant did he stop. Then he actually had the audacity to come to my table, introduce himself to my parents, and tell him that he knew me from my job. All the while, his wife was sitting at the table looking at me. And in that moment, I knew that she knew something was up. It's like she stared straight into my soul. She must have seen the way that I was looking at him, because she ran up to the table and introduced herself to me and my parents. When she tried to shake my hand, I didn't shake it back. My parents told me I was being rude, so I forced myself to shake her hand. 2 days later, she calls me and asks me what's up. But I lied and said that her husband was just a friend. Then I got an idea. I decided to be her friend. I asked her out to coffee and we had a great time. And little did she know that she was sitting with her husband's new wife. I feel like this way I can try to control their relationship from the inside. I confessed everything to my mom and she thinks I'm crazy. I think I'm a little crazy too. Am I completely wrong for this? How do I tell my fiance that I'm not attracted to him? Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's on Instagram. My fiance and I met in school over 10 years ago. We started running in the same friend circle, and after that we became best friends. Now, I will say I always knew that he had a thing for me, but he was always so soft and gentle. He was always my best friend that I could tell everything to. And when it came to guys, he always gave me the best advice. I knew he had my back always. After high school, he went away for college and I stayed home. And I started dating a ton of guys. Of course, I kept him updated on everybody I was dating. During the summer, he came to visit us, and that's when I realized he had a huge glow up. But he was still the same guy. He asked me if we could go to dinner, the movies. Essentially, they were like mini dates. And the more I hung out with him, the more I thought, okay, maybe I am attracted to him. At least I wanted to believe it. I mean, he'd be the perfect man for me. We know each other so well. He makes me laugh. He cares about me. My family already loves him. So I decided to give him a chance. This might sound bad, but his glow up was kind of like a trick. It tricked me into believing that I was attracted to him, but then I tricked myself into believing that I could be with him. When he asked me to be his girlfriend, I said yes. But anytime he tried to kiss me, I would always feel weird. He finally had to go back to college, and this is when I had to muster up the courage to finally kiss him. And so I did. It was not a good kiss. In fact, I didn't feel anything. But I continued to trick myself into believing that I'll feel something for him eventually. He was so in love with me. All he did was talk about me, always texting me, calling me. He was the perfect boyfriend. A year later, he actually proposed. And at this point, I had convinced myself long enough that I liked him. So I said yes. But as we started planning, I realized I am not attracted to him at all. Part 2 is, how do I confess to my fiance that I'm not attracted to him? Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's on Instagram. He planned out the most amazing proposal. He took me down to a lake where we used to hang out with all our friends. As we started getting closer to the lake, there was a pathway of candles. And as soon as I saw those candles, I knew that he was going to propose. And the worst part is the whole time he was proposing, I just kept looking at his face, trying to figure out if I'm attracted to him him or not, or if what I feel is just love of a friend that I've loved for years. I was so confused and I didn't know how to say, I don't know. So instead I said yes. Both of our families were right there hiding. They came out and congratulated us. My parents actually could not be happier. They love my fiance. How could they not? He's been my best friend for 10 years. I felt like I was in a racing car and I couldn't pump the brakes. Everything was happening so quickly and I couldn't say, hold on. Like, let me think about this. I was so confused and torn up, and I didn't want to hurt his feelings. I also didn't want to hurt my own feelings. I opened up to my mom and told her exactly how I felt. And she says, I'm not surprised. When I asked her why, she told me that she knew he was never my type of guy, but she knew that he could grow to be one. And that the love he and I feel for each other is just as important as the love a husband and wife might feel. But I explained to her that even though, yes, I truly deeply love him, I'm just not attracted to him. And she confessed that when her and my dad got engaged, she wasn't even in love with him, let alone attracted to him. But she says that all of that came with time. And that all we see in movies is people falling head over heels, having the best sex and the best relationships, and that I needed to realize it was only in movies. After talking to my mom, I felt worse about the entire situation. I was no longer confused. I knew I definitely was not attracted to him. And part of me knew that I would never come to be attracted to him. We had already been together a year at this point, and I still felt nothing when he kissed me. I felt like a liar, felt guilty. Then something happened. A friend group set up a whole party and they wanted us to come. But there were a couple of people that we had never met. And like a scene straight out of a movie, I see this guy from across the room and he looks at me. Instant attraction. I can't even describe it. It's like I just couldn't stop looking at him. And he couldn't stop looking at me either. Every time I looked in his direction, he was always looking at me. Then one of our friends introduced us, as in me and my fiance, to this guy. He was new to the friend group and he had just moved into town. This is what I'm talking about. I want to feel those feelings for whoever I end up marrying, instead of guilt and pity. I told my parents I was going to break off the engagement, but they want me to reconsider. And no, I haven't had any contact with that guy, obviously. The feeling he gave me, isn't that what I should be feeling for my fiance? I'm speaking to him tonight, so I will be posting a third part to this story time tomorrow. Wish me luck and give me some tips on what I should say to him. Don't want to hurt him, but I know he's going to get hurt anyway. And I don't want to lie to him. I just want to tell him the truth. I'm not attracted to you. But how do I say that without making him feel like he's ugly or something? Help me out. Talk your sister out. I confessed to my fiance that I'm not attracted to him. You'll never guess what he did. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. You guys tore me to shreds in the comments of the last video, so I did exactly what you guys said. I went to his apartment and confessed the whole thing. I told him that I loved him, but like a best friend. And that really at no point did I ever really feel attraction for him. You'll never guess what he said. He said that he already knew, but that he didn't care because he knows that I would come to love him too. I felt even worse after he said this. He begged me to stay, but ultimately I said no and broke up with him. Luckily, we hadn't spent any money on the wedding planning, but our families were really upset. His mom called me really angry and told me off, which of course didn't surprise me, but it stung like hell. I'm currently public enemy number 1, and everyone in our friend group hates me. Like, actually none of my friends want to talk to me right now. I feel miserable, but it took guts to do what I did. A lot of people stay in relationships like this because they're comfortable. So be as mean as you want in the comments, I don't care. I'm going to Mexico for 4 days. My plan is to run around in a bikini all day. I'm currently miserable, so you'd be happy to know. Send me your stories on Instagram. Self-care sister out. Am I the asshole for punching my sister's boyfriend after I found out he was abusing her? Disclaimer, this is not my story time. When I told my parents that my sister had bruises on her neck and her arms, they told me to stay out of it. Essentially, I needed to mind my own business. I could not believe the words that were coming out of my father's mouth. When I looked at my mother, she had tears in her eyes. And that's when I asked them both, as your daughters, do you think that we deserve to get abused? And of course, they said no. This is when my sister's boyfriend started insisting that she move in with him. I did my hardest to convince her how to. Short of tying her and keeping her in our house, there was nothing I could do. That's when I see my sister walking out of my house with her bags, only to move in with her abuser. Can you guys put yourself in my shoes? I was trembling with anger. I went to her and I got down on my knees and begged her not to leave, but she still walked out with tears in her eyes. I could tell she didn't want to move out. I didn't see my sister for another 2 weeks. She finally came over, and when she did, I interrogated her and literally recorded it. She told me that he wasn't abusing her as badly. He was only checking her phone and only letting her eat at certain times of the day, but at least he wasn't hitting her. And she told me the worst news of all. Proposed, pressured her into saying yes. My parents were happy. Part 3 is up. Am I the asshole for punching my sister's boyfriend after I found out he was abusing her? Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Not only is my sister now engaged to her abuser, my parents are happy about it. My parents know that they've already done it, so essentially, she has to marry him. At first, I thought the same, but the more I think about it, just because my sister did it with this man, why does she have to marry him? The abuse is abuse. There's no justification for it. I had to do something about it. I was at my wit's end. Picture this happening to your sister. What would you do? Found his mother on Facebook and went to visit her with my mom. I needed my mom to join me on this. The fact that she would just cry about it and not do anything pissed me off more than anything in my life. We showed up under the pretext that we wanted to have lunch with her. And to my surprise, his family is extremely wealthy. They lived in a great neighborhood neighborhood, and their house was the biggest on the block. And she also had an amazing spread for us, with caviar and champagne. My mom and I were stunned. I mean, her son doesn't look like the type to come from a rich family. He has a shitty apartment and no job. His mom told us all the tea. She hadn't spoken to him in over 3 years. He had slapped her before, and they stopped giving him money. So all the times that he said he was employed, it was his parents giving him money. His mom told us that we needed to get my sister away from him. And that's what we did. Part 4 is up. Am I the asshole for punching my sister's boyfriend after I found out he was abusing her? Once I found out from his own mother that he had abused her, my mom and I knew that we needed to get her away from him. We went straight to their apartment. At first, we could hear him telling my sister not to open the door. After 10 minutes of my mother and I begging, my sister finally opens the door. All I did was grab her and pull her out the door. When her boyfriend came at me, I punched him as hard as I could. And he didn't come after us. A few days later, his own mother sent my sister $20,000 to cover the cost of the lawyers. My sister got a restraining order. My mom kicked my dad out of the house, and the 3 of us live in peace now. I'm taking them to Europe for the summer. Would you have done the same? I accidentally cheated on my boyfriend with my crush. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. And if you want more story time, subscribe to my YouTube channel. My boyfriend is the definition of tall, dark, and handsome. Here's a little backstory. We met through friends, and he's been chasing me for months. We met at my best friend's birthday dinner, and that very same night he asked me out. At first I thought he was being super aggressive, but then I found out that he'd had a crush on me for months now. Apparently he'd seen me on my bestie's Instagram. And since then, which was months ago, he kept asking my bestie to set us up. But Bestie knew that I was not looking for a boyfriend. Okay, so there's this guy that I had a crush on. He and I worked together, and he was in charge of training me. After a week, I literally fell in love. But that's when I found out he had a girlfriend. And believe it or not, I was actually heartbroken. This led me to swearing off men. I really just wanted to focus on myself. I did not want to go on dates. I deleted all my apps. And that's why my bestie never told me about this guy. Okay, so fast forward a few months. I meet my now boyfriend at dinner. Like I said, he was aggressive. Then my bestie told me why. So I decided to give him a chance. This man was so devoted to me. He took me on a date every day for 2 weeks. By the end of the 2 weeks, he asked me to be his girlfriend. And how could I say no? In this dating economy, what man is going to plan 2 weeks worth of dates and pay for everything and be attractive and treat you like a queen? Then guess what? Next day I show up to work. My crush tells me that he found his girlfriend cheating on him and that he liked me. Go to part 2. I accidentally cheated on my new boyfriend with my old crush. Disclaimer, is now my story time. Send me on Instagram. And if you want more story times, follow me on YouTube. The very next day after my new boyfriend asks me to be his girlfriend, I show up to work and my crush tells me that his girlfriend cheated on him and that she broke up with him. And then he confesses that he's had a crush on me since I started working there, but that he never acted on his feelings because he had a girlfriend and he thought that she was being faithful to him. That's when he came in for a kiss and I let him do it. Okay, so here's where I messed up. I completely forgot that I had a boyfriend and that he had just spent 2 weeks wooing me, taking me out to lunch, whining and dining me every single day for the past 2 weeks. Yeah, that guy, I completely forgot he existed. I was so excited about my crush liking me back that my new boyfriend just slipped my mind. After he kissed me, he said, "I know you've liked me too." And so I told him that I did like him too. That's when he asked me if I wanted to go get lunch together, and we did. And we had a magical time. And because there was all this pent-up tension between us, stuff happened in his car, and throughout all of this, I still didn't remember my boyfriend. Not until he sends me a text message asking me if I needed a ride home. He knew my car was getting fixed and I was relying on Ubers. I mean, could this guy be any more perfect? And here I am sitting in my crush's car. But it gets worse. I tell him, sure, come pick me up from work and take me home. But when he does, my crush sees me getting into the car with him. Go to part 3. I accidentally cheated on my new boyfriend with my old crush. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. If you want more story times, follow me on YouTube. So after I've cheated on my boyfriend, he comes to pick me up from work to take me home. And when I'm getting into my boyfriend's car, my crush, who is my coworker who I just happened to hook up with, sees me getting into my boyfriend's car. Of course, my boyfriend and I drive off, thank God. This man texted me right away and said, "You didn't tell me you had a boyfriend." My stomach drops instantly. He's right. I didn't tell him that I had a boyfriend. Because at the time that I was hooking up with him, I didn't even remember I had a boyfriend. Remember, my boyfriend had asked me to be his girlfriend just the day before. He was so angry, he sent me another message. It said, "Don't talk to me again. I'm blocking you. And I'm going to try to get you transferred to another location." I could not speak. I just burst into tears. My boyfriend, who's sitting right next to me, asks me what's going on. And that's when I confessed it to him. I told him that I accidentally hooked up with my coworker, who I'd had a crush on. That's when he stops the car and demands that I get out. He said my coworker did the right thing. Then he told me to delete his number and just drove away. So not only did I lose my new boyfriend, but also the crush that I'd been crushing on for months. So I did the logical thing. Showed up to my boyfriend's apartment that night and begged him to take me back. After 5 hours of discussing everything, he finally agreed to giving me another chance. Do I deserve this? Or am I just the most horrible person ever? Bye. Do you have a bestie that's a little bit toxic? Story time. Disclaimer, this is my story. When I was 20, I moved to LA. I was so broke, I had 4 jobs at the same time. I worked at a hookah lounge where I cleaned the toilets and served. I also worked at a Mexican restaurant, I walked dogs, and I was a personal assistant. The Mexican restaurant I worked at was on Sunset Boulevard. And boy oh boy did I meet a lot of celebrities. On one occasion, I met a girl who was in a couple of movies. Is she in movies now? No, she's not. So I would say she's like an F-list celebrity. She was the type of girl that got everyone's attention, wanted to be the life of the party. And as soon as I walked up to her table, this girl wanted to adopt me. She kept saying things like, oh my gosh, you're so cute. Right away, she was acting like my best friend. It was as if the it girl, the popular girl at high school, wanted to befriend me. I fell for it hard and fast. She had a lot of money, and because I was so broke, she would pick me up and take me places with her. She took me to a couple of industry parties. This is where her envy was showing. She introduced me to a couple of people. And by a couple of people, I mean huge celebrities. But you know how she introduced me? You guys, meet my little friend. Her name's Esther, and she's a struggling actress. She works at a Mexican restaurant. I wanted to crawl in a hole and never come out. Part 2 is up. You know that toxic bestie that we've all had? Story time. Disclaimer, this is my story. After she embarrassed me on purpose by introducing me as her little friend who works at a Mexican restaurant, I wanted to crawl in a hole and die. I was standing in front of a bunch of celebrities while this F-list celeb made me feel so small. But she was also the kind of girl that would recover really quickly. She would start complimenting me on how beautiful I was. So I would feel better about her having just embarrassed me. I would somehow just justify it in my mind. She was also the type of girl that would start telling me all of her secrets. And this is when I made a big mistake. I started trusting her with my own secrets. This is what those toxic besties want. They want you to trust them so quickly and for you to fall right into their trap. Well, I did. I talked to her about my relationship with the fiance that I had at the time, and I even confided in her about the essay that I had experienced. And before I knew it, she started copying my style. My first language is Spanish, and sometimes I answer in Spanish. If you ask me, do you want a bottle of water? Sometimes I'll say sí or no. So she started saying sí or no. And I laughed when this happened. I quickly realized that I was influencing her more than she was influencing me. On one occasion, she invited me out with her friends. Suddenly, I became the topic of conversation. All of her girlfriends started asking me about my SA and what that was like. And they started bringing up all the issues I had with my fiance. I realized that everything I had told her, she repeated back to them. I felt like an animal in a zoo. They stared at me, asked me questions, and waited for me to answer. They lived for the drama. My drama, to be exact. After that, I realized she wasn't a friend. She was a frenemy, a gossiping, drama-addicted frenemy, waiting for me to fail so that she can feed off of me. You know you have or have had that bestie. And if you still do, I think you know what you need to do. Self-care sister out. Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I come from a really big family. My mom has 5 sisters and 1 brother, and my dad has 4 brothers and sisters. All of them have their own kids, so I have a lot of cousins. And this means we have a lot of family get-togethers. Every single weekend, someone is hosting a party. We all get together and eat, and it's actually a really nice time. But there's always that one creepy uncle. In my case, it's my mom's brother. He's 46-year-old and has never married, but he's a bachelor. He's got money, so he basically has a bunch of sugar babies. Whenever my family tells him that he needs to get married, he says he'll never get married to anybody. He thinks women only exist for the pleasure of men. When I turned 16, I noticed that he would stare at me a lot. At first, it was just staring. Every now and again, he never did anything really creepy then, but just the staring was enough for me. I never told my mom about it then, not until I turned 18. This is when he started making comments like, wow, you're growing into your body, or wow, you got great hips. He would make comments about how I was growing up, like, ew. He even told my dad that he needed to keep me away from guys because I was growing up really quickly. And because of my curves, men would think that I was a woman. This is when I finally told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable. She thought it was funny at first, so I avoided him at all costs. Part 2. Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's me on Instagram. When I told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable, she laughed it off. She thought it was funny. She said, oh, you know how he is. So from that point on, I basically avoided my uncle every time we were at a family event. When I turned 20, this is when things got even worse. He would ask me things like if I was a virgin, or if I had a boyfriend, if I had ever been on dates. And one time he even told me that he would get very jealous if I ended up bringing a guy to one of our family events. One time he complimented me on the dress that I was wearing, so after that, I only wore baggy clothes to family events. The fact that I had to change the way that I dress so that he could control himself makes me sick. I finally told my mom again that my uncle was always bothering me. It's when she told me that the world is filled with men like him, and that all I needed to do was just ignore him. So I told my dad everything. My dad took it a little more seriously and told my uncle that he needed to stop making comments. My uncle just laughed. Part 3 is up. Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I finally told my dad and he told my uncle to stop making comments. My uncle just laughed and told my dad that he was overreacting, and that all he said to me was that I was a pretty girl. What a liar. In part 1 into, I told you guys that it was getting worse, but here's where it actually gets even worse. Like I said, I have a really big family, so my cousins are growing up too. One of them just turned 13 and my uncle cannot stop staring at her. She's maturing a lot quicker than most 13-year-olds. He's already staring at her. So here's what I did. At the next family event, I sat right next to him. Every time he would stare at one of my cousins or try to make a comment at me, I called him out for it in front of everybody. I even recorded the things that he said. The fact that I even have to do this at a family event makes me sick. Instead of enjoying my time with my family, I have to sit next to my creepy uncle policing him. Anyway, it's totally worth it though. I'm making sure that my cousins don't feel uncomfortable. After I had enough recordings of him saying nasty things, at the next family event, I showed it to my grandma. I basically played it for the entire family. My grandma told him that he couldn't come to any more events if he was going to behave that way. And of course, he apologized to everyone right away. But not to me, he apologized to my dad. After his half-ass apology, he was let back into family events. I don't think that's enough punishment. Give me some ideas because I think I deserve justice. Creepy uncle. I've cheated on my husband over 20 times and I don't bother hiding it because I secretly hate him. Disclaimer is not my story time, it's not on my Instagram. My husband is the biggest vagina in the world. Here's a little backstory. He and I met 5 years ago, and as soon as we met, I was the one that was interested in him. Which drives me crazy now, the fact that I chased this man. Disgusting. All I did was ask him out on a date and he said yes. After that, he fell in love with me and I did too. Within the first couple of months of our relationship, I realized that he was extremely sensitive. This man would cry a lot, and his feelings would get hurt very easily. So I basically had to start walking on eggshells to make sure I wouldn't offend him. For example, I once did my own laundry and I didn't do his. Number one, he was really upset, and number two, he started crying because he said that I didn't love him enough. His mood swings were all over the place. And then the worst part, he got fired from his job and basically didn't bother looking for another one. He told me that he wanted to live off of his savings for the next couple of years. This man never wanted to pay for anything. If we went out to dinner with his friends, he would never offer to pay for my dinner. His friends would pay for my dinner. I was so beyond embarrassed. I was footing the bill for everything. He barely paid me rent. Part 2 is up. I've cheated on my husband over 20 times and I don't bother hiding it because I secretly hate him. Disclaimer, it's not my story time, it's on Instagram. So aside from him not ever paying for anything and fully expecting me to pay for things, I began to hate him. You might ask me why I married him. He comes from a really rich family, so I thought he would eventually ask his parents for money. But no, he did not. Before I knew it, 3 years had passed. And like I said, he is such a big vagina. He always cries about everything. He was always in a bad mood. He was always getting sick. It got to the point where I couldn't even be around him because every time I was, all he would do was complain about what he was feeling that day. He always had a headache or his back hurt. And so he would ask me to do things for him. I was constantly having to give him massages, was always going to buy him medicine. This man would wake me up at 3 a.m. and go ask me to buy stuff. I was literally taking care of my child. Oh, and let's talk about our sex life. It was boring. He always did the exact same thing, never wanted to try anything new, and basically always complained about having to do things to me because it pained him. So I was completely unsatisfied, like all the time. I began hating him more and more every day. Even the sound of his voice triggers me. You might ask me, do I love him? I do. I care about him, but I'm not in love with him. Part 3 is up. I've cheated on my husband over 20 times and I don't bother hiding it because I secretly hate him. Disclaimer is not my story time, it's on Instagram. After realizing that I was living with the man-child who made me do everything for him, who cried all the time, who was always so sensitive and always needed something, and complained 24/7, I decided to start cheating. A few years ago, I had met a guy through a coworker. We always followed each other on Instagram and I knew that he was attracted to me. And he's pretty hot. And rich and good looking. So I decided to reach out on Instagram and asked him if he wanted to go out. Not only did he say yes, he planned a whole outing. We went hiking and we went to get massages. Then he took me out to dinner. And then we went to his place and had amazing sex. I would see this guy about 3 times a week. Then I started hooking up with another guy that I met at the gym. This guy was really hot, but he didn't have a lot of money, so we never really went out. It was just plain sex, but it was good. About 6 months later, I met another guy. Again, amazing sex. Do you think my husband noticed anything? No. I would talk to these guys on the phone while my husband was in the same room. I would be setting up dates with these guys in the same room as my husband. Do you think he cared? No. I would even wear sexy outfits to go out with them and he never asked anything. He would just say, have fun, and then he would call me to complain about what he was feeling and what he wanted me to buy. Am I terrible for doing this? Every time about how my fiance is refusing to help me plan our wedding. Should I leave him? Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's on Instagram. I'm so sad about the palette. My fiance and I met a few years ago through friends. When we first met each other, I had a really bad first impression of him. First off, he was completely up himself. All he did was talk about himself and never once asked me questions. We were surrounded by other people, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt when he asked me out. I said yes, but our first date was kind of the same. He only really talked about himself, his career, the things he likes to do, his favorite foods, his family, his dog. I eventually just started volunteering information because he wouldn't really ask me. After our date, I didn't speak to him for a full 2 weeks. I was really turned off by his attitude, but then he messaged me saying that he was really nervous and that he realizes that he probably could have been a little more talkative. I said, yeah, you could have been. I told him how I really felt and he did apologize and he asked me out to dinner again. This time I invited him to my apartment and he made us a full 4-course meal. By the way, he's a chef. Obviously, that night, I completely fell in love with him. He made all of my favorite foods, but the gourmet version. A few months later, we became boyfriend and girlfriend, and there were still a few things that I didn't like about him though. Like, he never really had anything to talk about other than himself. Exactly a year after we met, he decided to propose, and I said yes. But when I asked him to do things for the wedding, he says no. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my fiance is refusing to help me plan our wedding. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I said I'm on Instagram. To be honest, when he asked me to marry him, I was totally blindsided. Honestly, felt like our relationship was starting to get stale. So when he asked me to marry him, I was like, for real? He told me that I was the first person who ever made him feel important. And looking back, I realized that it's because he only talked about himself and I really let him talk about only himself. Anyway, I immediately said yes out of the excitement. But when I called my mom to tell her, I was actually crying, which is like, okay, maybe I shouldn't marry him then. A few weeks into our engagement, we hadn't talked about planning at all. So I decided to ask him, like, what do you want the wedding to be like? That's when he told me that he didn't really care, but that he would just give me money for it. I mean, on one hand, that makes me really happy because I don't want my parents to have to pay for the wedding, and he has a lot of money. But on the other hand, I want him to be involved, especially for the food because he's a chef. I decided to hire a wedding planner because my job is extremely busy. I work in marketing. Asked him to go to a few meetings with me. He said no. When I finally found the perfect wedding planner, I asked my fiance if we could go have lunch with him, and he said no. This is when I blew up in his face. I asked him why he wasn't participating at all. That's when he told me that he was too busy at the restaurant, that he didn't have time to do anything with the wedding. I was like, okay, fine. When it came time to choosing the caterers, I demanded that he go with me. He told me that he would try to get off work, but he never did. Every time I tried to schedule it, he would say that he was busy with work. That's when I told him that his restaurant, which is super fancy, should just cater the whole wedding. And he said no. He told me they were way too busy and ready to get a Michelin star, so there was absolutely no way they could cater his wedding. That's when he said, you can handle it. I trust you. I went home and cried the entire night. Part 3 is up. Story time about how my fiance refuses to help me plan our wedding. Claimers to know my story time is sending me on Instagram. After I got home and cried, he came home and asked me what was wrong. That's when I told him that he didn't seem excited about the wedding and that leaving all the planning to me made me feel like I was his employee, as if I had nothing better to do, which I do have my career just like he has his. Not to mention the fact that me picking everything I want for our wedding makes it feel like it's my wedding and not ours. He told me that I was overreacting. He also said that he was excited for the wedding, but that he was too tired and too busy to even think about it. That's when I told him that I was really busy and I was really tired too. And he begrudgingly told me that he would carve out some time this week so that we could speak to some of the caterers. I told the wedding planner and he started setting up some meetings. But of course, my fiance canceled on the first 2. He did show up to the 3rd one, but all he did was criticize the food. Then we went cake tasting. I expected this to be fun. When my friends have had cake tastings for their wedding, they always have so much fun. As soon as we showed up to the cake shop, he asked me, where did you find this? That's when I told him that our planner had found it. He said it looked like a supermarket bakery. That's when I told him that I don't mind supermarket bakeries and that it was probably just as good as a French bakery. He laughed and said, wow, you're funny, babe. We tasted the cakes and he actually liked them. Thank God. But then he requested to go to more cake tastings. We ended up going to 5 other places. This was already too much for me. I got a new account at work and I'm still trying to lose weight for the wedding. So him making me run around trying to taste cake is like the straw that broke the camel's back. After 2 weeks, we finally decided on a cake flavor. Most people must have fun planning their weddings, right? But I just feel like I'm drowning. I have to make all the important decisions on my own. I decided to involve my mom and sister and they've helped me so much. Of course, the wedding planner is helping me too, but ultimately the decisions have to be made by me. He hasn't made any effort to help me with anything else. Kinda want to break up with him, but I feel like this isn't a big enough reason to break up with him. What should I do? My boyfriend confessed to me that he's attracted to my best friend. Should I leave him? Disclaimer, is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I know you guys are gonna all say yes immediately, but hear me out. My boyfriend and I have been dating for 6 months. My best friend and I actually met him at a bar. That night, I never expected that he would ever come after me. I consider my best friend the prettier of the two of us, so I'm used to her getting hit on instead of me. But that night, my boyfriend came to me. He talked to me pretty much the entire night, and my best friend told me to go for it. So I did. He and I spent the night together, and after that, we were inseparable. To the point where he wanted me to move in with him after 2 months. My parents thought I was absolutely crazy and they didn't want me to move in with him, but I did anyway. I come from a Latino family, so this was absolutely reprehensible. I went against my family's wishes and they actually stopped speaking to me for a little bit, but luckily I got them back. My boyfriend during that time gave me all his support. He told me that my family would come around eventually and that they would see that we were in love. So living together was the logical next step. After 3 months of living together, I knew that I wanted to marry him, and he would talk about marriage all the time. He asked me what kind of ring I would want and what I would want for the proposal. We even started talking about our honeymoon. I was also starting to get in the best shape of my life. I was looking super snatched. My boyfriend told me that he loved the way that I look, but that he didn't want me to get skinny. Again, I just felt like he was supporting me and loving me. Around this time, my best friend started dating somebody. After a few weeks, they got really serious about the relationship. And of course, we went on double dates. After the 3rd double date, I noticed that my boyfriend was getting a little annoyed. I got the feeling he was jealous of my best friend's boyfriend. Follow for part 2. Boyfriend confessed to me that he's attracted to my best friend. Should I leave him? Disclaimer's not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. I asked him if he was jealous of my best friend's boyfriend, and that's when he said no. But every time we would go on double dates, he would get in such a bad mood. 3 weeks ago, my best friend told me that she was moving in with her boyfriend. And when I told my boyfriend that they were moving in, his face almost went green. I asked him what was wrong and he said nothing. After that, he went into the bathroom and didn't come out for 40 minutes. Again, I asked him if he was okay and he said yeah. And I sat him down and asked him to be honest with me. That's when he said, I'm attracted to your best friend. Instantly started to cry because I had already been suspecting it. He explained to me that he didn't have any feelings for her until she got a boyfriend, and that he felt that he had some sort of ownership over her. Before my best friend got a boyfriend, the three of us would hang out a lot. And not once then did I ever get a feeling that he was attracted to her. He told me that he would never act on his feelings, but he didn't want to go on any more double dates. I asked him if he wanted to be with her instead of me, and he said absolutely not. He said that I was the love of his life and that attraction only meant attraction, that he didn't have feelings for her. A few days later, he took me to the most expensive restaurant in our city and asked me to marry him. But I didn't know what to say. I can't stop thinking that he's attracted to my best friend. Part 3 is up. Boyfriend confessed to me that he's attracted to my best friend. What should I do? Disclaimer is not my story time. Was sending me on Instagram. After he proposed, I told him I didn't know what to say. He told me to think it over. I finally decided to tell my best friend what my boyfriend had told me. But he had confessed that he was attracted to her. First she laughed. I told her no. I'm serious. He confessed that he's attracted to you. That's when she told me I needed to break up with him. That's when I told her that he had also proposed. And she said, well then you really need to break up with him now. That's when she told me that she didn't want me to resent her and that it was completely out of her control. And I didn't. I promised her that I would never resent her for my boyfriend being attracted to her. It's not like she ever did anything on purpose to make him feel attracted. She also told me that marrying him right now would be rushing into it, and she's kind of right. We've only really known each other for 6 months. Then she told me that she's never gotten the feeling that he's attracted to her. She's never caught him looking at her or anything like that. So now her theory is that he's looking for an easy way out, and that he probably wants me to break up with him. But my boyfriend is still sweet and super affectionate. He's constantly showering me with love. My best friend thinks that if I stay with him, our relationship will suffer. I've known my best friend longer. What should I do?